This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist, author, and television arts commentator Matthew Collings. Collings has been a fixture in the British arts media for more than 30 years, while maintaining an active art practice. He creates sublime, large-scale abstract paintings as part of his partnership with his wife, Emma Biggs. And over the course of the last 3 years, Matthew has produced thousands of popular drawings of unseen art history and imagined collaborations. In the conversation, we discuss his journey, the nature of artists, the state of the art world, his paintings, his drawings, and his being the subject of an international manhunt. And now, a discussion about the life-changing capabilities of art with Matthew Collings. Matthew Collings, thank you for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Matthew, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you're at a dinner party and you're seated next to somebody who has no idea who you are or what you do. How do you describe to them what your work is?
Well, it's a little bit difficult in my case because I have done several things and I'm known for one or two of them. And at the moment, I'm not really doing the thing I'm most known for. So I'd have to preface however I explain myself with that complicated thought. And I'm most known for doing TV programs about art, which are quite sophisticated ideas, but put into language that anyone can understand. And now, to me, that's very different to the ordinary, simple ABC of art explained in a popular program. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a very, very important distinction, but maybe to some others it's not. So you could say that I became famous over a period of about 30 years for putting out programs and many books, actually, that kind of popularized both contemporary and historic art. But I must say that all that time I was doing also what I exclusively do now, pretty much, which is making art. And in the last couple of years, the type of art I've mostly been making is drawings, but I also keep up a collaborative painting practice with my partner, Emma Biggs. Our paintings are very abstract, and they're really about very, very complex color patterns. They're sort of allegories for reality using only color relationships. Whereas my drawings have a lot of illustrational content. You know, they're about art and culture. They're often about art history, and they're kind of rather hilarious depictions of well-known figures of culture and art doing things that an educated audience has in their mind about those people, but they probably have never seen them being illustrated doing them quite so literally as I do it.
And so it's really sort of a life and practice in 3 parts then, right?
I guess. You know, it's funny, I've never narrowed it down to 3. I think there's loads of things going on all the time, but they're all me, so I don't really worry about the identity issue. It's only when I'm asked a question like you've just asked me that I worry about it. I'd be interested to know, how do you make it 3? You mean my collaboration with Emma?
I hate to simplify it to 3, but I was just thinking of it in terms of the media, the collaboration with Emma, and the drawings. And I know those are 3 really big buckets. There's probably lots of mingling and more things that don't even get included. You mentioned all of the writing, of course, which is probably a 4th. There are lots of silos here, right?
Well, they all flow into these drawings. They all flow into each other. But, you know, these drawings really would be impossible without that history, because the drawings involve a lot of writing in that the titles are often very involved. But also the ideas of the drawings really come from all the research and writing that I've done over the years into art. So that the comic aspect of the drawings is a lot to do with ideas about art that I have, that often have occurred to me as sort of useless knowledge that I have, and I'm now harvesting in
Right.
the form of these drawings.
Yeah, that's one of my impressions about you is that you're a real collector of information, data, stories, artists, art history, and that passion of yours for collecting that information has kind of turned into the sort of things that you're able to output.
Yes, that I guess that does sum it up really. There's an anxiety about all this that I sell these drawings on Instagram,
Hmm.
and for the last 10 days or so, my Instagram account has been hacked.
Oh, no.
So no one listening to this could look at my drawings. Otherwise, I'd say, go onto my Instagram account and you can see the drawings. But I'm hacked at the moment, and I haven't recovered my account yet. So I hope to do it in the next few days. But everyone will just have to take my word for these drawings. You can find them on my Facebook account, but I don't use that so much. On my Instagram account, you would see something like 1,400 at least drawings from about the last couple of years.
Wow. Well, I hope you get that straightened out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. So when you came out of art school, how did you get into media? I know you started at Art Scribe. How did you make that jump from writing about art to actually being a presenter? Did somebody read your work and say, you know what, he simplifies this to the point where we feel like there's benefit being on screen? Or how did that happen?
Well, not quite, no. When I left art school, I had a girlfriend at the time who worked at an art magazine. And so through her, I got a job at that magazine doing the subscriptions one day a week. I was processing the subscriptions. And I did write them one review once. And, they quite liked it and they thought it was clever. But it was very hard for me to do it because I wasn't a writer and hadn't been educated in any way. I had no real formal education. I was very inarticulate, actually. And so they asked me to do more reviews, and I agreed, but they were very torturous to do. I found them very, very hard, and I would never have called myself a writer. It just happened to be an art magazine that had contributions by artists. I thought I was an artist. And as the years went by, I gradually took over that magazine and became its editor.
Oh, wow.
And I was there for about 8 years, and I was very confused about my own art. I wasn't really sure what it was. I'd done quite well at art school towards the end of my time there, and I'd assumed I'd be a great artist, as soon as I stepped out the door. And as some listeners will know, that doesn't always happen. And it so happened that somebody came along to the magazine from the BBC, and by spooky coincidence, that very person is coming round to my house today.
Oh, my.
With his wife to have tea with us. But in any case, that person was at the BBC, and he came round to ask my advice about something. And because of that meeting, when I later left that magazine and he heard that I'd left, he invited me to come and work at the BBC. And I did. And the reason was that he thought I did put things quite simply, and I was able to explain very complicated matters. And he worked in a bit of the BBC that considered itself very hip, and they wanted to know about what was going on in art and who knew about that stuff and who could explain it so that people at the BBC could get it. And he thought that I'd be good at that. And after I'd been at the BBC for some months, sort of sitting around, not knowing what it was and what I was doing there, and feeling a bit alienated, they started this very, very ritzy late night culture program called The Late Show, which was on every night for an hour. And I was a researcher on it. And anyone who knows anything about how TV works will know that sometimes the researcher kind of slips over to being a presenter, because the researcher knows stuff, but maybe has a bit of natural TV ability. So they get groomed and trained up a bit to be in front of the camera. So it was a funny sort of transition. I had no ambition whatsoever to be on TV. And I hadn't had a background that would suggest that I ever would be on it, because it tended to be Oxford and Cambridge educated people, which I wasn't at all. And I only knew what I knew, which was art. But that was lucky, because on this Culture magazine program, all they wanted me to do was to talk about art.
Right.
So I did that for a few years, and there were little magazine type programs. I did hundreds and hundreds of them, and I worked very, very hard. Then I slipped out of that, and for a couple of months or a year or so, I was unemployed. And then a different channel, which is a very, very big channel, English people will know this, so Americans won't.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very big channel in England called Channel 4.
Mm-hmm.
And they came and approached me and said, would I do, as opposed to the little items, as it were, informative items I'd done on this magazine program, would I do a great big series, a 6-part series with a great big budget, and tell the Channel 4 audience what modern art is? So I said, yeah, I would do that. And at that time, because I didn't really have any work, I was in a gap between the BBC
Mm-hmm.
and Channel 4. I'd written a book about my experiences as a child growing up with a certain sort of dysfunctional family and with art a bit in my life, and I made that book about the contrast between the 1950s idea of art, where everybody's authentic and sincere, and the 1990s idea, because it was now the 90s, of
Right.
art, where everything's ironic and glamorous and shallow. All these things all happened at once. So I suddenly had a great big TV series that got a lot of publicity and was very, very successful, and a book out that was published by David Bowie, who everyone had heard of. So they thought, well, that book must be really cool because David Bowie's cool. And, I'm the least cool person in the world I've ever known. And I just accidentally tumbled into David Bowie's lap, as it were. And so a lot of things happened at the end of the 90s that made me very famous, at least over here, and then in some other parts of the world as well. And that fame kept going for a couple of decades, and it was fun and sort of rather silly. And I didn't particularly respect myself for doing it because I thought I was an artist, really. And then it wore off, and one thing led to another. And there was this other thing. Me and Emma Biggs, 20 years ago, we started doing our paintings together.
Okay.
And they're very serious. They're the absolute opposite of ironic. They're simply like beautiful objects that shimmer and have a sort of intense color harmony. And we've been doing them for 20 years. We have a gallery, and that gallery sells them. And we're called Biggs and Collings, and we still do them. But Emma's also a full-time mosaicist. She runs a sort of global mosaic empire, really. And I now do my drawings as well.
Sure.
But I'm answering via a very long answer your question about how I got into the media. And it's a torturous subject for me because it was never anything I wanted to do. But when I did get into it, I found I was quite good at it. So it made me sort of despise myself a bit. And also, I've certainly used what I learned from being in the media. You have to speak quickly, and you have to be able to compress things and have headline thoughts, and maybe be funny in the way that you sum things up. And all that stuff has paid off in these drawings, I would say.
It reminds me of the conversation I had with Jerry Saltz, where his aspiration was to be a professional artist. That was what he thought he was going to be. It just turned into something else, and it was never intended. And he didn't have even the classical writing education, but he loved to talk about it, and it turned into something. And his writing and the whole media kind of became his practice. And that was one of the questions I asked him is like, if you always aspired to be an artist, are you sure you don't still have that itch to make the art? And, it's obvious that you do, and because you still make, right?
Well, I never didn't make art. All the time I was at the BBC, I had a studio. I even did the MA course at Goldsmiths in Fine Art while I was running around the world making art, making films. And I always thought that I always had this sort of illusion, really, that it was art that I was doing. I did this other stuff to make a living. But it's only now, I would say, with these drawings, that the ideal I had when I was about 17 of being an artist who sold their art to make a living has actually become a reality. But unlike Jerry's much more famous and successful than me as a writer, but he simply gave up on art because he had a sort of epiphany where he realized that he wasn't really, the myth, his own self-mythology was wrong, at least according to his account. He wrote something very good on it, where he just realized he simply wasn't an artist. And he thought, well, maybe I'm a writer. And it turned out that he was, and he's a very good one. And in my case, I had to give up the the illusions I had when I was 17 were, just assumed that I was a genius. And anyone who's a teenager who's involved in art is probably a bit self-deluded. I had to give some of that up, but I never gave up the idea that I was basically some kind of maker of visual art.
It's funny. It reminds me of a quote I heard you say one time, which is, "That's the thing with artists. They're so narcissistic. They really do believe that other artists aren't any good, whereas all they mean is that they want the attention." And so,
Yeah.
do you believe that artists need this self-aggrandizing perspective in order to make their work?
Yes, I think they're the most emotionally primitive people on earth. They're so. I couldn't believe it. I've interviewed so many hundreds and thousands of them, and they're all these incredible babies and narcissists, and they have no idea how transparent they are. The absolute conviction that if they put down somebody, that means they're going up. It's like magic. They're like the most primitive nutcases in their delusions of sort of power, which of course we all know that when somebody's kind of beating their chest like that really they're insecure.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, at heart, they don't really have that confidence. I mean, maybe sometimes very, very, very old artists are a bit wiser, just as very, very old people are sometimes a bit wiser. But on the whole, artists are terrible people, very, very ugly personalities. And I think the worst phase of the bad personality of the artist is the present social media one, where you get artists who aren't even artists, who aren't even well known, who are going on about pretentious stuff and how sensitive they are, and talking about we artists and claiming a sort of status of specialness over all other humans, which I find I never know whether to laugh or cry when I read that stuff.
That's interesting, and that's a conversation I've had with folks before in terms of the democratization of a platform like Instagram, giving every artist an equal platform. Because 50 years ago, Castelli would be the gatekeeper, and he would say, "This is who's important." But now everybody can claim the same real estate.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily wholly bad, but I mean that does relate to what I was saying. Everyone can be as pretentious as everyone else. Like, you don't even have to be. The democratization is a pretentiousness, really. You don't even have to be a recognized artist to behave like a complete arsehole. And I think that, but otherwise, democracy is a value in itself, which is always good. And elitism is a negative value, which is always bad. So the elitism of 50 years ago, and certainly the elitism of 75 years ago, good riddance to it. I'm glad that it's gone. I don't think it was so much that Castelli was the gatekeeper as culture itself, and art culture and the discipline of art and the history of art. They all made up a sort of gatekeeping force. But there were very, very wrong exclusions, which current democracy has, to a great extent, either overcome or highlights and quite rightfully struggles against, which is ethnicity and gender and class and education. All those things are quite rightly broken down as barriers to art. But there's an elitism of goodness and quality, which is very, very complicated. None of us can really sum up what that problem is, which goes with, but isn't the same as, an elitism of success and recognition. So they go alongside in this uneasy relationship. We don't really know if the recognized and the successful are the good or have the quality. And so we're very confused about success and recognition. And what social media platforms will give you is one of those factors, which is recognition.
Right.
And that can confuse the primitive artistic mind. So the person thinks that they have actually been recognized just as an artist, whereas in fact they've been recognized as someone on social media.
Well, I mean, it kind of feeds into a larger issue of trying to discern what good art is in this time, because there are people that love to talk about the art market in terms of dollars. And
Right.
oftentimes the art that's selling for the biggest numbers, and it may not be the art that winds up being appreciated 20, 30, 50 years from now. And so it's kind of hard to discern. But, it's funny, like when I hear artists talk, they kind of want it both ways. Look, it's hard being an artist. And, people want to pay their bills. They want the money, but they also want the respect and the recognition, right? And they want to be known and appreciated.
Well, everybody wants, regardless of what their job is, they want to be recognized. They don't want to be invisible, and they want to be respected. They don't want to be disrespected. But you don't have to be pretentious to get those things. You can have a sense of mutuality and earn the right to recognition by being a person in a group who has something to contribute to the group. I think while I sympathise with people who are creative and have got involved with art and want to make art, I sympathise with their desire to be recognised and to be taken seriously. But I find it weird, and I feel personally alienated from the artificiality of the weird sort of self-image that you encounter on social media, which is no different to the actually famous artists, but it's just without the art. It's with a very mediocre type of art, but the sounding off is just the same as any other idiot like Richard Serra or Jeff Koons or all those complete twits, who are very, very formidable artists, but as people, they're just sort of grotesque abominations, really.
Let's talk about your practice with Emma. So these pieces, we would describe them as explorations in color, pattern. How would you describe the work to somebody who hasn't seen them before?
Well, if you said what are they from the point of view of what I was just talking about, I would say they're very anti subjectivity, individual subjectivity. They're democratic artworks. There's two of us. There's not eight of us. There's two of us. But still, that's different to one of us. So the whole idea of a star is taken out. And one person has to go along with another person. There's got to be mutuality. So all the things that I was just deploring about what goes on now with social media narcissism in relation to art, we fight in those paintings. And those paintings, they're very, very narrow in their concerns. We try to make them as glorious as we can within very, very narrow parameters. So with mere color tone relationships, we try and make some kind of representation of the world. And we try and do it in a way that we think of as ethically right and socially good and on the side of the angels, as it were, democratic works. And that's it. There's nothing more to it, really. Anyone who sees them will see a lot of, as it were, faceted, a plane faceted into little triangles, which you could call maybe they're diamond shapes. Basically, it's just an orthogonal grid, which is then divided again diagonally in both directions. So you end up with diamonds. And we fill in each little diamond shape with a certain color and tone. Emma decides those colors. She makes all the color decisions, and she mixes the color as well. She mixes the oil paint, and I apply the color. So I'm like the actor, as it were. I have to animate the paint on the surface.
Right.
And Emma is the screenwriter and the director, and I would say she's more the boss, although it's democratic. I more take orders from her than she does from me. She has to respond a bit to how I put it on, so her decisions are altered a bit by what I do. But I have to really, I don't have any choice as to, if she says, we're putting this color there, I don't say, oh, I'd rather put a different color there. So, and I don't resist it. I mean, I see the efficiency of the work that we do, and I'm very happy about the relationship that we have doing those paintings.
They're beautiful work in it.
Thank you.
There's this tension between the saturated and unsaturated sections, and which
Exactly.
kind of it raises questions about the picture plane. Is there depth, right? What's in front? Is there something obscuring it? And you can kind of interpret some of it just as being bezeled, but It's really interesting. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with someone about Matisse, and they had mentioned Matisse making a leap from painting as a depiction of decorative art to the painting itself being decorative. I feel like part of that applies there.
Well, yeah, except that we don't. Matisse never. He very, very rarely wasn't depicting something. Even at his most decorative, they are motifs that you could see as signs for foliage or something in the world. Whereas our paintings are landscapes without the landscape. We like to think of them. They're built in the way, and they're the processes of making and the thought structures about unity and harmony and about getting many, many, many elements to all resolve into one pulsating harmony. As anyone painting a landscape hundreds of years ago, or a portrait hundreds of years ago, they'd have all this process, but without the depiction. So Emma's thoughts about what colours go where are to do with getting less and less arbitrary over the weeks and weeks and months. It starts out completely arbitrary with the first colours, and then gets less and less, so that in the end everything has a place. And she can see, and I see as well, many, many structures that each painting has, simultaneous possibilities of different rhythmic structures that are all woven together. You might start to look at some kind of yellowy brown, and then you'll see variations on that yellowy brown and also contrasts with yellowy brown. So the painting looks very different every time you come to it. I mean, and that's the aim for it. Those are the abstract, I would say, aims. It's about sort of visual intensity, visual engagement. You've got to stick with it. And you've got to have the kind of relationship with it that you might have if you were looking at a Renaissance painting or an Impressionist painting or a post-Impressionist or an abstract expressionist painting. Things that have a kind of content, heavy breathing content. Well, we don't have those contents. It's purely abstract. But we're trying to make something that still engages you as much as those other paintings where their greatness is known, and believed in already, and culture has already said that, Monet is good and Tintoretto is good. And even somebody who isn't very knowledgeable about culture can be amazed by a Monet and by a Tintoretto because they can see something in the world there, which is represented in a rather magical way. With our painting, you've only got the magic stuff and you haven't got the something in the world.
That's really interesting. After hearing you say all of that, I feel like I see more in there. You say landscape without the landscape. The colors, they really do remind me of the variety of pale blues and grays and even the warm tones that you would see in the sky. And then there are those kind of organic, earthy tones that, kind of contrast with it. Interesting, Emma being a mosaicist, I'm sure she spends a lot of time trying to portray some figurative part in her other work, whereas here it's, I hear you often use musical related terms in describing the works.
Well, only because there is a sort of strand of critical writing about art, and particularly to do with modernism, where musical terms make sense. I mean, it's the approach of the writer and the type of art that's being talked about. Good writers about Paul Klee and Kandinsky and the sort of early types of abstraction often talk about it musically because the work is rhythmic. There's a certain kind of I've now forgotten that musical term. We've got lots of different rhythms all operating.
Yeah, I think you may be thinking about syncopation.
Exactly, many multiple rhythms all syncopated. Exactly that word, yeah. So harmony and unity and rhythm, they are all things that we look for. But those are very useful, abstract and precise terms. But they might suggest that we work sort of systematically and intellectually. And I must say we don't. It's all pure intuition. I just intuit how to put the paint down based on what the paint feels like. And Emma intuits one color next to another color, not according to any system other than what you could say is kind of in her mind. She's got a kind of color system in her mind just from years of experience of working with color. And really, her decisions and mine, I talk about what's in her mind, but they're almost mindless, in that they are simply intuitive. it's trial and error. We do a certain thing, we follow it up, and then we alter it based on what's there. We have to keep revising our thoughts about what's there. We keep saying, "Oh, well, yesterday it looked like something. Today it's looking like something else." That's probably because we put in those things yesterday. What is it that we need? We've got to take out all the colors that look like this, and we've got to put in some others that have a more sort of stinging power, or others that are more dull, or others that are more viridian. So we're always correcting. I think I said earlier that we keep on going until there are no more errors or wrong things.
Mm-hmm.
And a wrong thing is again a musical thing. It's sort of out of tune. It's an out of tune note. An out of tune note in a piece of music. It doesn't make you scream, but there's something dead there. It's not expressive in that with that particular note. So that whole picture, the whole painting has got to be expressive and resonant and doing something. And it will do it according to how every single tiny element in it is dynamic. And is dynamically working with every single other element.
Does there wind up being a focal point or a point of emphasis, or is the whole pattern?
It's really the whole thing. The
Right.
whole thing is shimmer everywhere. Like when you walk into certain cathedrals and mosques, and the whole thing is shimmering, and that's really based on the eye of the craftspeople over the centuries who created those patterned environments. Because they've been thinking about the whole thing. What makes this whole, with all the columns and the shape of the roof and the conventional shapes that are required by mosques and cathedrals. The sort of Middle Ages type amazing works of patterned architecture. I think that's probably our main model outside of the history of art. I mean, our main is more like the history of art.
Well, you have me thinking about Byzantine mosaics, and it makes me wonder whether you guys have been tempted to do any gold leafing.
No. Well, Emma has in some of her mosaic work, but we haven't in our paintings.
So your drawings, I would describe your drawings as unseen art history and imagined collaborations. How would you describe them?
Well, that's a very nice description. Thank you. I recognize that, definitely. I don't know how to describe them. I want to bring them out as a book at some point, and I'm always a bit puzzled about what they should be called, what the book should be called. But what you described is accurate to what happens in them. There's a few recurring figures. Mm-hmm. They tend to be the artists who I think, are the most popular artists in the minds of people involved with art at this moment. I think 20 years ago, there would have been a different range. So, I've got Hilma af Klint, Francis Bacon, Frida Kahlo, Philip Guston, Picasso, Joan Mitchell, the abstract expressionists, Van Gogh. I think that those figures, de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, those figures occur the most as individual figures. And then there are groups that recur a lot. And then there are scenes. And then sometimes I step outside of art history and I do this, as it were. And I do sometimes the things that appear in art history, like crucifixions, mm-hmm. or scenes from the Bible. And then sometimes I do cave artists. And sometimes I even do things that nothing really directly to do with art, like confessional 1950s American poets who committed suicide. I love all them. Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath and John Berryman. And I think that's because I think I'm sort of branching out for scenes, historical scenes that have something to do with my biography, because my father committed suicide.
Right.
And my mother had nervous breakdowns. And those 50s poets were sort of nervous breakdown poets, really. Confessional poets. And because I'm confessing a lot because I do self-portrait as well, because I'm confessing the nonsense that goes on in my mind a lot with these drawings. I like that aspect of poetry, confessional poetry. But mainly it's art history. So I've done hundreds of Philip Guston, mm-hmm. Because I think people like him. I never really could go along with all the fuss about Philip Guston. I think he's fine, I don't think he's all that good. But I do really like the fact that he impresses so many people. And I think I like the thing that he impresses them for. I think it's freedom. They think in a way, it's a baleful influence because people think they can do any old stuff, really, and that'll be accepted. Whereas his funky comic strip style, which looks low skill, was backed up by very beautiful artistic measured balances, formal balances.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's rather dull in his use of colour, so he's, it's always the same dirty pink. It's not of any interest at all as colour. But as surfaces, expressive surfaces, and as I say, these balances of emptiness and intensity, he is a really great artist. But his interest for me is that he is the same as people's interest in him, that he stands for freedom, that he brought the social into art. Art was rarefied, and he brought the sort of hurly-burly of life into art. So when I first started drawing him, I would get him to be painting the Klan, say, or being in his studio with all his pots of paints. And I did pictures of him where it was pretty much like him, but I'd sometimes have him looking at a newspaper that had Joe McCarthy on the front, or he might be remembering when corrupt police shot one of his murals in the 30s. But eventually I branched out a bit and I made him comment on things that were anachronistic. Like he might comment on Oprah Winfrey's interview with the Royals or George Floyd's murder. Because he is a commentator, I thought, well, he could comment on things that go on now. I've got him to comment on a lot of things that happen in England, in Britain. And and also sometimes I get him to run around with Rembrandt, or he meets Hilma af Klint. I get him to paint Jesus sometimes, scratch his head and wonder about Jesus, because he wonders about evil. He said, I wonder what it would be like to be evil. That's why he painted the Klan. He worries about Satan and Jesus being crucified. And likewise with all the other artists. I sometimes get Hilma af Klint to fight hell, or to make Hitler sign a pledge of peace and goodness forever. And the spirits that give Hilma af Klint the idea of what to paint, the spirits told Hilma af Klint what to paint, which she communicated with by seance. I get those spirits to command the evil dictator Hitler to sign a pledge where there's only ever going to be peace from now on. So there's a silliness to the drawings, but the silliness is based on an absurdity which is drawn out from what people actually think. People are sentimental about Hilma af Klint. They never question the spirits don't exist. No spirits told her anything because there's no such thing as a spirit. What she is, and this is a more sophisticated thought than most people really have about her, is a sort of independent woman who created a culture of art making, but also of being, where in a fiercely patriarchal society, she made her own matriarchy, really. She was a solitary figure who didn't have a man. She just did this art decade after decade, and just said, spirits told me to do it. I communicated with the spirit Hiliel or the spirit Gregor in a seance, and Gregor told me, you're going to spend 15 years painting these paintings for the temple, and you won't know what they mean. And I think that's great, her self-invention. In some ways, I even identify with it. But I certainly don't identify with their achievement. Achievement is very, very great, I think. But so I have this funny relationship to all of them. I think abstract expressionism is something that's so deeply over and pointless and it doesn't really impact on us at all, really. But people are very sentimental about the abstract expressionists. They want to think, that's an artist who suffered. Well, I suffer because no one recognizes me. And, de Kooning didn't have a show till he was very old, and therefore I must be like de Kooning. And I like to sort of follow up all the implications of people's fantasies of these artists, and they can be the fictions that I come up with can be quite elaborate, and intricate, and can go into realms of very, very great daftness, but they never really truly depart from a foundation of historical reality. There's always some foundation of believability about the things that I make the figures that I draw do.
Is it important that you work within a cast of characters that people would know so that they have some...
Yes. They have to... I feel I'm addressing an artist, an audience that has some interest in art. And in a way, I'm commenting on that interest. And that's one of the things that connects to my history, that I was always very concerned when I was making my programs and writing my books with what my audience thought they knew. Because I knew that some of them had more knowledge than others. Some of them worked for Frieze magazine, or were art dealers, or were artists, and some of them were ordinary people who thought art was glamorous and they should get to know it. And some of them are art students, and I was always thinking, here's my audience, here's my crowd. I'm talking to my crowd, and things that I say, some people won't know the references, others will, but they all have to get something from what I'm saying. And I suppose the difference with these drawings is that I'm now drawing stuff which I know that what I just said still pertains. That some of them will have heard of Hilma af Klint, but a lot of them won't. They'll have to look her up, and then they'll think, "Oh, that's an interesting artist. Oh, look, and he's saying that about her." And then they'll find out more on their own about Hilma af Klint, and then they'll see that what I'm saying is sort of has a certain foolishness but also a certain seriousness.
But like you said, it's not always artists. I know that you love to include dead rock stars, right? Like, I feel like Jim Morrison keeps popping up in people's studios.
Well, I love Jim Morrison because I love the way that he had the potential to not die. And, if he lived at all, he'd be a reformed alcoholic, because he couldn't have been an alcoholic at that level and survive. So he'd have to go to AA meetings. And being so good looking, the alcoholic women would always be impressed that it was Jim, even when he was 55, he was a bit fat, but he'd still have those amazing sort of eyes and the bone structure. So he's a bit paunchy and alcoholic, and there are flies flying around him. But he's at the AA meeting because he's so Jim Morrison-ish. He goes to the AA meeting with a bottle of brandy in his pocket, and the naughtiness in the AA attendees, he brings that out. Sometimes I get very, very, very great women artists who've been very inspiring figures for women artists. I get them also to fall for Jim, like Frida Kahlo and Louise Bourgeois, and wonderful, very, very high achieving women artists. When they see Jim, they just fling off their clothes and they rush the stage. And he just takes it for granted because he died so young. He knew nothing else than that wherever he went, everyone tore off their clothes and threw themselves at him.
Sure.
But I also draw other rockers. I draw Charlie Watts punching Mick Jagger. I draw David Bowie a lot because he has a lot to do with my life, and he published 3 of my books, and he sort of in some ways transformed my career in a very good way. And also my audience respects David Bowie and likes him very much, and people like Iggy Pop and Lou Reed, and in a way the sort of orbit of Warhol includes those figures. And Andy Warhol is one I forgot to mention earlier, who I'm always drawing.
In terms of, like, you've been looking at art for a long time, for someone who's trying to train their palate, I mean, is there a particular ethos that you use when looking at and assessing art? I mean, is there something structured and formal, or has it gotten to the point where it's really all in your gut?
Oh, I'm not sure what your question means, but if I reviewed exhibitions for a newspaper for a few years called the Evening Standard, and I would take each show that I was sent to review on its own terms, and I think I'd do that naturally anyway. So they tended to be big museum shows. So but sometimes there'd be contemporary art, or and not even very good contemporary art. Sometimes good contemporary art, but mainly there were things like Rembrandt and Caravaggio and Picasso and that. So I would think, well, what are the issues here? How do you assess this art? How is it meaningful to assess this art? Well, one way might be politically. But that way wasn't really given to me. This was an extremely right-wing paper, so I couldn't, I'm actually quite a socialist, really. I could never really say anything like that. And so I'd have to think, well, how do you assess it aesthetically? What's a meaningful way of assessing Caravaggio aesthetically? Well, you'd have to think about the history of art, what's his place in the history of art, and how do you compare like to like? What are other paintings that are like? Who are other artists that are like Caravaggio? And then within Caravaggio's output, which are the good ones, and why are they good? What does good mean? Because it wouldn't mean the same with David Hockney as it does with Caravaggio, and it wouldn't even really mean the same with Rubens as it does with Caravaggio. So these things that I'm telling you about when I was reviewing, they come naturally to me anyway. So you ask, how do I respond to shows? Well, I respond in this way. I try and think. I don't even know I'm doing it. I'm deconstructing myself now, telling you how I do it. But it occurs to me that what I do is I approach things, turn me on, or I'm indifferent to them according to if I find them intense and good. And I find them intense and good according to really quite classical criteria, critical criteria. That Saul Bellow is good at a certain time in the 20th century, and then the world's biggest bore, a really boring right-wing idiot guy for 40 years or something, who accidentally wrote a few good things. But before that, when I used to read him in the 70s, you just didn't question his greatness. And plus, by the 70s, he hadn't done so much wrong. It was the last 30 years where it all went wrong. So one is thinking, where's the intensity in the thing I'm looking at? And so I just feel that. But if I had to do some work of commentary on it, then I'd have to come up with these frameworks for commenting on it that would make sense to people. So maybe that's two answers to your question.
Sure.
You really are, how do I approach things? But as I'm a commentator as well, I sort of found myself drifting in my answer to how I would comment on the results of me approaching things in art.
Sure. Well, not that you would go back and rewatch late show episodes from the 90s, but if you did, do you think you would agree with what you said back then, or do you feel like your tastes have changed and evolved over the last 30, 40 years?
Yeah, I think it's impossible for them not to, but on the whole, I do feel very connected to the person I've always been. I feel like I'm 15 all the time. The context of making programs, little explanatory programs to a popular audience for the BBC 30 years ago, is different to some other contexts in which I've had to explain things. So I wouldn't always recognize, acknowledge, or be sympathetic to those frameworks or those contexts. But what I was able to say within them, I would probably agree with. I can't really think of things that I've said that would really jar with me now, unless they're factual inaccuracies. And unfortunately, I'm often inaccurate because I'm thinking about other stuff. So I often get dates and names wrong. And maybe sometimes I've said things recklessly, where I had a point in mind, but I didn't develop the point enough. So I sound stupid. I once said that I thought situationism was stupid. Of course, I don't think that, but I said it at a time when there was a lot of falsity around the issue of situationism. In the 90s, people were trying to make themselves seem clever, that they'd heard the word situationism, that they'd heard of some of the issues of situationism. And I was sort of rebelling against that shallow connection to situation. And I now feel a bit mortified when I think back to I can't even remember where I said it. It might have been in a big TV series I did once, but I'm sorry I did that. And I sometimes wake up at night begging forgiveness from the situationist.
So in that answer, you said that you feel like you're still that 15-year-old.
I do.
And it makes me want to ask, one time I saw you make a veiled reference to an event that happened in 1969 involving a kidnapping. And
1970.
Okay, so I was close. So is that a story you're willing to share? Because I don't think I got all the details, but it sounded very salacious.
Well, it's a very important milestone in my life where a woman paid for my ticket to go to Canada, and effectively she was encouraging me to run away from my single parents. I didn't have a father, I had a mother who's been dead for some years now, but I ran away, and legally this woman had abducted me, and so I was kidnapped legally, and it was a press scandal. It was all over the world, actually, and there was an Interpol hunt for me in Scotland Yard, and eventually I was actually picked up by the Mounties in Toronto. I was living in Toronto. They were technically called the Mounties, and I was lying in my sleeping bag listening to Country Joe and the Fish on the floor, and these 6 guys in suits came in like a David Lynch film, and they said, "Are you Malcolm Collings?" And they had they weren't wearing the red outfit; they were wearing sort of FBI outfits. And they showed me their badges. They made me get up, and they took me downtown. I was absolutely terrified, but I just sort of said hippie things to them. And in fact, I saw a very groovy-looking black guy on a bicycle. I was in the back of the police car, and I was absolutely terrified, and I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And I made a peace sign at him. And the guy on the bicycle made a black power fist at me. And I thought, oh my God, no one's going to love me. I'm just absolutely alone here. And it was terrible. And I had to go to the Canadian remand home for some weeks. And the detective and a woman police officer flew out from Scotland Yard. And they took me back in handcuffs to Heathrow. I was met at Heathrow by loads of press all photographing me. It was in all the papers. I got some of the cuttings still. And then I was in a remand home in England. In those days, there were skinheads, and I had long hair and beads and stuff, and they used to spit at me at night. After a couple of days, they all liked me, actually, because I told them stories and amused them. I managed to survive, physically survive. And then the woman who kidnapped me got 9 months for her crime, and she got out after 6 months. And there was a guy, a 21-year-old, very nice guy, who had also helped me, a Canadian guy, who got me through customs and everything. And he got a suspended sentence, as long as he didn't do anything else like that. And this woman was a very great woman who was a peace campaigner, an activist, a political activist at the time, who was in my life because she'd been a friend of my father in the 50s, and she'd known my mother all my life. And she knew that my mother had breakdowns. I'd been in a children's home when young, and this woman was responsible for me sometimes being able to come out of the children's home and be in a nice environment in Chelsea, a more sort of a bohemian environment than the very grim environment I was in the children's home. And she looked after me sometimes when my mother couldn't look after me. I'd been out of the children's home for a couple of years. I came out when I was 13 and a half. And by now I was 14 or so. My mother was in a very, very bad breakdown. And this woman made a weird decision that I should just run away and get away from her, because she'd seen I was getting involved with drugs, which I was. And it was all going to end badly. And I'd probably go to Borstal, which is kind of an English term for youth prison. Mm-hmm. And so she just made this decision, a pretty wild decision, actually. It was a bit sort of over the top, really, to send me off to Canada. And inevitably, I got caught and brought back and everything. But it led me to, I was put in a therapeutic community that was quite enlightened in the countryside for a few years. And all this accounts really for why I don't have any formal education. I never really had any education whatsoever. And at the therapeutic community, we didn't do lessons. We were all considered so maladjusted. We were sort of on the garbage heap of despair, really. People who survived that place, many of them died. They didn't live long lives because they simply had not been brought up properly, and they were unable to. They didn't have the tools to look after themselves. And I was just fortunate. So in some ways, I was fortunate. In some ways, I was very unfortunate. But this woman kind of coming to my rescue was fortunate, but also a bit mad when she, as it were, kidnapped me. So, yeah, that's that story. Her name's Rachel Pinney. Anyone can look her up. Dr. Rachel Pinney. She was a radical lesbian in the 60s.
Given those circumstances, where and when did you find art? Because it seems like a lifeline for you, right?
I was good at it from the year dot. And it was part of... I had a sort of magic idea about it. I thought it would save me. But that was partly because people didn't bother to look after me because I thought I'd be fine because I was very good at art. And when I was in the children's home, it was clear that I had that talent and the other kids didn't. And at school, I was always known to be very good. I had a sort of I did art that I very like what I do now, funnily enough, which was sort of graphic, recognizable. You can see immediately what's happening, and some people just have that as a talent. It's not a rare talent at all by any means, but I thought it was. I thought it was a magic gift that I had, and it was what made me go to art school. So the one bit of formal education I've had, but as listeners will know, art school isn't very formal. I got myself into art school when I was 19, and I was there for about 4 years. But once I went to art school, I couldn't do that stuff anymore. I was confused by the whole history of art, and I immersed myself in reading Art Forum and sort of introductions to contemporary art. And I tried to understand what conceptual art was, and what colour field painting was, and what political art was, and what photo art was, and what happenings were. And so I just couldn't do that type of graphic art anymore. And I had a lot of confusion throughout my life about things that I could do naturally, that came to me very easily. I was very confused about valuing them. I suppose what got me into art in the first place, the answer to that question does relate a bit to what I'm doing now. The last time, when I was about 17, I sold quite a lot of paintings for about £15 each. And they were a bit like these drawings. They were sort of made up out of my head, and they were intuiting what people would like, but also surprising people a bit. But now I have a more focused idea of what people means. I mean, in those days, it was who would rescue me from being a maladjusted child. And now I think it's, well, who's the art audience? This strange group of people who are seduced by the glamour of art, to some extent by its intellectual meanings, to some extent by its soulful meanings, its substitute in culture for religion, say. And to some extent, they're seduced by its ethical sort of purity. Artists are supposed to be sincere, and art is supposed to be deep. And also, people think that it's talented. Art involves talent and a sort of magic ability. So it's done by magicians in a way. And sometimes that audience is partly artists themselves, which is that's how I began talking to you about artists who nowadays have funny ideas about themselves. And so I'm thinking about all of those things. But I have very particular ideas which find expression in these drawings. I can see how I'm expressing them after I've done the drawing, but while I'm doing it, I do it without really thinking, actually. And that's the difference between art I do now and what I did at 17 or indeed 14 and 15. At 14 and 15, I drew like R. Crumb with a rapidograph, and I was very, 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 very fascinated by Crumb. And when I was 10 or 12, I drew pirates and things that young boys draw, and soldiers and cowboys and things. But now I draw what I think art and culture consumers imagine the world to be. I draw what I think their values are, because in a way I am them. I'm in that crowd too.
Matthew, I think I've taken up my allotted amount of time of your day, and I can't say thank you enough for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and maybe I can have you back on once you publish the book of all these drawings, or
that would be lovely.
And we can talk more. But you're a wonderful person to talk to, especially if you love art, and I love the way your mind thinks. It really kind of opens up my mind to all sorts of possibility. I really appreciate your time, man.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.